Hi everyone, I'm Ryan and this is That Random Geeky Guy. Today we have a PC build guide for you. So I wanted to take some time on this beautiful Saturday afternoon here in the UK. It is quite warm, so I will be honest, I've got some doors open and stuff to let some air flow through. But if you hear a pitter patter of some paws, it's because my dog's about. So just be cautious of that. Anyway, like I said, we're doing a PC build guide today. It's quite relaxed and it's just showing you the basics of building a PC. Whilst the parts that you see in front of you aren't really that relevant because building a PC in essence is kind of building a PC. I will talk about what we're actually doing here. We are early 2021. There is a massive silicon shortage worldwide. You guys don't need me to tell you this, but the latest graphics cards are exceptionally expensive. Processors are starting to get a bit more into stock in places, but overall now is not an economical time to be building a brand new PC. So this is, as I'm known for, a budget PC. So this is using used parts to create a capable 1080p gaming machine, but that's kind of the outcome goal of this computer. It's not the point of the video. The point of the video is it's a PC build guide. But anyway, we've got this case here, which I will link down in the video description. All of the parts, if you can get them, are available new from Amazon. Things like the SSDs, things like cooling, heat sinks, all that sort of bits and pieces. I will put links below so you know what they all are. So yeah, we've got a case which is a micro ATX case, because you'll notice the motherboard is a micro ATX. So it's perfectly designed for that. It's not too big, pretty good design, but there we go. Let me just get this out of the way. I'm going to clear a load of stuff off the table so we can get into stuff on a bit by bit. For you, if you are building a PC, a couple of important things you're going to need. You're going to need a set of tools. So I've got a little ratchet screwdriver here that I often use, and I've also got my toolkits. I've gone through this in the past. I will link the video below if you want to check out what's in here. But it's all the bits and pieces you're going to need if you want to build a PC. Well, I lie. You don't necessarily need all of them. It's what I use. But other than that, if you've got a screwdriver, a clean surface to work on, that's pretty much what you need. Let's move this to the side because I am going to be using that. And we will move that to there. I have got a second camera here so you guys can see a little bit more of the shots. But ultimately, this is all going to be about me describing what I feel is the best and most convenient way to get your PC built. Okay, let's pop those down. Pop this down. Okay. Right. So, the motherboard that we're using here is actually a motherboard from ASUS. It's an ASUS H110M, and it's to use with the processor that we see on here. I'm actually going to pop the processor out as part of the build guide to show you it going in and all those sort of bits and pieces. But the processor that we're using here is an i5-6500. It's a quad-core processor, perfectly capable for 1080p gaming. There it is there. Pop it into the second camera so that you can see it here. And yeah, it is an Intel build. So, big differences quickly before we put the processor in is let's talk about the differences between doing an AMD build or an Intel build. You'll know my personal rig is AMD, and this budget build I'm doing is Intel. So the big main difference is the location of the pins. So with an Intel build, you've got pads on the bottom of the processor. Loads and loads and loads and loads of pads. And that's been the same across multiple generations. But then in the actual socket of the motherboard, you will find a array of pins. So these are all around here. They're quite delicate, so it's important that you're quite careful with them. But essentially, when you're putting the processor in, those pads are making contact with those pins. The difference with an AMD processor is the pins are on the processor, and they go into small holes in the socket in the motherboard and then clamp in. Anyway, in terms of getting this processor in, what you want to look for on here, there's two things on an Intel processor that you need to look out for when putting it into the socket. The first one, if I just bring this back into shot over here, is there's a little gold triangle in the bottom corner. There's also a triangle in the bottom corner of the socket, so you can actually relay those two things together. But you've also got two little notches up here and up here, which connect to notches that are in the socket as well. And these are all about getting everything lined up perfectly. The important point here is that as you go to put the processor in, is to make sure that you're not using any force. You're literally just lining it up into the socket, like so, popping it in, giving it a little wiggle just to make sure it's seated, and that's it. It is in there. You've then got a retention arm that's going to hold that down. All we do there, we flip this over, pop that over into the retention pin here, push down on the arm, and lock it in. And that's it. We have put in the processor. It's quite simple and easy to do. So the next thing I'm going to do probably is RAM. So this particular board has 2 RAM slots. That makes it quite easy in the fact that if you're using a 2 RAM kit or 2-piece RAM kit like we are here, 16 gig of DDR4, 3000 megahertz RAM, it's really easy, just populating both of those sockets. Now, some motherboards will actually have 4 sockets. And if you've got a dual kit like this, you need to make sure you're putting them into the right socket. Now, a vast majority of those, you will put the first stick in the furthest slot away from the processor. You'll then skip one and put one in the next. So it's kind of alternates. And that's to make sure that you've got dual channel memory. Ultimately, you need to read the user guide for your motherboard, but I say 9 times out of 10, you'll find that that configuration when you've got a 4-slot board is the way to do it. Okay, let's pop these in. So this is quite easy. You've got a notch here on the RAM, which will line up to a notch that's in the RAM socket. On the actual motherboard, you've got 2 little fold-down clips on one end of the RAM slot. On some motherboards, you will find them on both ends, but on this one, it's just the one. So we just pop those down. And then we just line the RAM up to make sure that the little slit is lined up with the post inside the socket. We push down on both sides, and then you'll get a satisfying click on both ends as the RAM goes into the motherboard. And then just rinse and repeat. For every other RAM stick you've got, obviously if it's a 4-slot board and you've got 4 slots, you do the same with all of them and just fill all 4 slots. And that's it. Now, as part of this, you'll notice I'm kind of stood in front of a radiator. Now, the reason for that is that when you're working on computers, whilst the risk is, in my opinion, minimal, it's been kind of investigated before, but you do have a risk of static discharge damaging your equipment. Now, there's a couple of ways you can deal with that. You can wear a anti-static wristband or put it around your ankle, connect it to a radiator or whatever it might be, or you can just continue throughout the build to keep touching something that is grounded, like a radiator or a power supply or something along those sort of lines. So just to take that extra caution, it is something to consider. Anyway, let's get back into the build. So we've put the CPU into the board. We've also put the RAM into the board. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to get this board into the case. Now, there's a couple of things that you kind of want to do in a certain order. One of those things is making sure that you've actually got enough room to work inside the case. Let's get the case up here on the side and we can get into it. There we go. Okay, so just going to flip that over. Take off the side tempered glass panel. We are doing a few cosmetic parts to this one that isn't necessary in retrospect with a lot of builds, and something that you might not do. One of the things that we're doing that is kind of, like I say, shall we say an extra, is we're using sleeved cables. So sleeved power supply cables, the 24 pin, the CPU power pin, and the PCIe power. So these are extension kits that run off the existing power supply. The reason I kind of bring that up is making sure that you've got room in the case to work. One of the big things that always stands out to me is actually using the CPU power cable and installing that before you put the cooler on. So trust me with this. If you don't install it before you put the cooler on, you're going to be in a position where actually it's really difficult and really challenging to actually get your hand in there to put that cable in. But, as some of you out there will know, also fitting a cooler, especially to an Intel rig, will often mean having to use a backplate. So you put a backplate on the back of the motherboard to put the cooler on. Now, the challenge is that with some cases, especially older cases, that's something that needs to happen before the motherboard actually goes into the computer. Now, with a more modern case like this one, they think of that. So with a more modern case, you actually have a cutout in the motherboard tray that is accessible from the other side and the rear panel of the case. So in this one, if I pop this down, tilt this up to this camera, you will just see in the top of the frame here, you've got a cutout, so you've got access to the back of the motherboard. This particular case came with a fan that's in the back here, which is an ARGB fan, and it comes with ARGB connectors. This particular motherboard, because it's a budget build, doesn't have them. I've got some spare Corsair fans and a Corsair light controller, which I know budget build, but it's spare parts, so that's why I'm kind of using them. So this is going to be redundant. It isn't going to be used. It can be used in a future build. Always important when you're doing budget builds, if there isn't any parts, if there's parts that you're not using, make sure you keep them. Because like I say, there's every possibility that you will have use of them in the future. Okay, let's get this other side panel off because we are going to need access to the rear of the motherboard to put on that back plate. There we go, pop this one down here as well, just so it's nicely there, ready for me to kick over later. Okay. And this is a brand new case, so it's just undoing all the little bits and pieces, little packs of screws and zip ties and stuff like that come with the case. Just give you a bit of a run round of the case itself. So in the front here, we've got three 120mm fan sockets. It is a solid fronted case with side vents in terms of airflow. This particular build won't have really high thermals. It won't get that hot anyway. But I wouldn't recommend a closed fronted case like this for something much higher end. So my personal rig I use at the moment, as of the start of May 2021, I use a Ryzen 9 5950X and an RTX 3070, both which produced a fair amount of heat, but I use a Fractal Design Meshify case, which is mesh fronted for much more airflow. Anyway, on the back, you have got, like I said, that motherboard tray cutout. You've got a route here for cable management, loads of cable management anchor points throughout the build. You've got a 2.5-inch drive bay here, and then you've also got in the bottom here more drive bays, which can be used for 2.5 and 3.5 inches as well. PSU there in the bottom, a nice place to stuff all your cables. And then from the front, you'll see there is a PSU shroud. You can just see the side of the PSU through that. Other than that, you've got 4 PCIe slots with this micro ATX design motherboard. That's kind of to fit in line with that. Other than that, whilst this is a budget case, it's actually quite sturdy. The finish is nice. Every edge is rounded, so it's not sharp. Actually quite like it. Anyway, let's get into getting the motherboard in. So, pop quiz, real quickly. What do you have to do with a lot of motherboards? Not all of them, but with a lot of motherboards, what do you have to do in the case before you put the motherboard in? I will wait for your answer. So yeah, I can't really wait for your answer because I can't hear you, can I? Anyway, so this is what needs to go in. It's the I/O shield. This needs to go into the back of here before you put your motherboard in. Trust me, do this now because you will massively regret it later because it cannot be done later. Now, some motherboards do have these integrated, but obviously with this one, budget build, it doesn't have this integrated. So this fits into the back of the case. You'll see it from this side on this camera. The only important thing you've got to do is just make sure you put it in the right way round. So with this particular one, the audio jacks are at the bottom. So there we go. We're going to pop this one in to the bottom. And it is literally just a case of A, make sure you don't cut yourself on it, and B, get everything lined up and push it in. And it will hold itself in place just with a friction mount. So all quite simple. That's it. And you can see on the back here, we now have the I/O shield in place. Next up is your motherboard standoffs. Now, this particular case doesn't come with them pre-installed. So some cases will have motherboard standoffs pre-installed. This particular one doesn't. If you do have them pre-installed, especially if it's a full-size ATX case and you're using an ITX or micro ATX motherboard, make sure there isn't any standoffs in place of where there would normally be holes, because if that's just rubbing up against the back of your motherboard, that can damage traces and isn't a good thing. So let's get into this little baggie, pour those out onto the table, and then just remind myself of where on here we need to be putting in our motherboard screws. Okay, super, nice and easy. So we've got this row. So let's pop this one in. So for those new to this kind of thing, motherboard standoffs are designed to lift the motherboard slightly off the rear of the motherboard tray to prevent shorts with the metal that is there. So this particular motherboard has 6 motherboard standoffs, or should I say anchor points. So we need to put in 6 of these in all of the right locations before we put the motherboard in. So the motherboard standoffs are all in. Now I'm going to pop in the actual motherboard. Real simple here, just making sure that you line up all of the ports on the motherboard with the I/O shield on the back. Some cases will actually have like a little nubbin rather than a standoff that will hold the motherboard perfectly in place for you to screw it in. This isn't one of those cases. So here we go. While I'm screwing in these, when you are putting in standoffs, if you are, just remember with a lot of cases, especially this one which is a budget case, just factor in as well that that metal that you're screwing it into is fairly cheap, so don't over tighten them because you'll end up just ruining it. Okay. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised by this case. It's got a fair amount of space up at the top. I think you would potentially get a 240mm rad at the top of here because there's enough space for it if you were water cooling. So an AIO would be a good addition. What it's going to mean for me is fairly decent space to run cables. Okay, here we go. 2 more to go in. Now for this particular build, we're using two SSDs, so one for a boot drive and one for storage. It's a very cost-effective way of keeping your computer fairly fast, especially game load times and boot times for your PC. So if it's in your budget, it's something I would definitely recommend. Anyway, those are in, motherboard is in. As you can see here, we're all in there nicely, so fits in good. Okay. So next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare these cable extensions. So these are the cables that I'm going to be using in here just to get a better aesthetic look. Bear in mind, in terms of building a PC, this is completely optional. This adds absolutely nothing to performance. This is just about looks. Now, with these, you do tend to have cable combs. So these cable combs are designed to try and keep these things in order and make sure that everything lines up. We're going to need those cables later. That's PCIe. Okay, there's our 24 pin. And there is our CPU pin, which I'm hoping splits because that's an 8. Yes, it is. Fab. Okay, so this particular motherboard has a 4-pin CPU power adapter. The cable comes connected as standard as an 8-pin, but it comes apart. So you can use it as a 4-pin. Right, let's have a look at these cable combs. Now, we don't really massively need to use cable combs on this one because it's going to be very quick in terms of in and out, so you're not really going to see a lot of the cable, but it just makes sense to use one of the cables so you're using the whole kit. Okay. There we go, that's in. So you can see, hopefully there, the cable's gone in here at the top. In fact, actually, let me swing it round to this camera. So you can see here, the cable has come from the motherboard and up through that grommet there. For cable management, and that's then going to obviously connect in the back of the case to as an extension to the existing CPU power coming off of the power supply. Now what I'm going to do at this point is, because I'm not using that second 4-pin, I'm just going to use a cable tie just to pre-manage that before we get onto cable management later. So that's that one in. Like I said, because you see very little of that cable, I'm not going to use any of the cable combs, but with the 24-pin, I definitely am. So let's get this one ready as well while we're doing it. So these are cable combs. Let me bring it across to this camera so you can see them. So very simple. These are just plastic or metal combs that these cables all slot into just to make them a little bit more uniform in terms of how they look when they are in the case. Now you will get, depending on which orientation you put the cable clips into, you'll either get the top poles of them, which is this edge. So you'll either get this edge or you'll get the solid edge showing front and center. I want the top of the poles to be showing, so I just need to make sure that I'm putting them in around the right way so that once they're done, they are all in. So while I do this bit, which is really boring, I will get this done and I'll be back with you in a sec. So the cable is all done. It's got its cable combs on. Let's just pop it down in front of this camera so you can see what it will look like from the outside. And the idea is that it gives you the ability to train the cables. Anyway, enough about these, because like I say, this is an extra. This isn't something you necessarily need to be doing as part of a PC build. It is purely cosmetic. But what we are going to do is get this connected into the 24 pin on the motherboards. Just line it up with all the different slots, push, and when it is in, you'll get a little bit of a satisfying click to make sure it's nicely seated. Do make sure it's nicely seated, by the way, because if it isn't, you aren't going to get a boot. So there we go. And again, that's just going to leave the cable down the back ready for the power supply to go in. Now we've got those cables in, we can look at mounting the CPU cooler. So I'm just going to make sure I've got all these cables tucked away, giving me a nice, easy way to just lay this down. Ready to get this cooler in. So the cooler we're using today is a cooler from a company called Deep Cool. It's just a good-looking cooler. It's reasonably priced and is perfectly capable with its 4 heat pipe design to cool this i5 6500, which, to be honest, isn't a particularly hot processor. This is the first time I'm using this this particular cooler, so wish me luck in terms of the mounting system. Let's see how we get on. This is, let's say, is a heat pipe tower design. So the idea here is you've got these heat pipes which draw heat away from the heat source, this case being the CPU, pulls it up through this fin array, which are aluminium fins, and then you've got on the front here a 120mm fan that's pushing air through those fins to essentially dissipate that heat that you're drawing away into the outside environment. And that's basically how a tower cooler like this works. It has, I believe, let me just check. No, it hasn't got thermal paste pre-applied, so we will actually be putting some thermal paste on today as well. But other than that, let's find out which of these mounting systems we need to be using. My guess it's going to be this one, but I am going to have to refer to the manual to make sure that we're using the right mounting system. So let's see just how easy this one is. Well, that's AMD, so we don't want to do that. Let's do this one. Okay, here we go. Yeah, it is going to be that one, so fairly easy. Cool. Okay. Brilliant. And we've got to make sure that we use the right holes for the socket that we are actually using, which is an LGA 1151, which is detailed on there to make sure that we're using them. Did they print it on here, I wonder, as well? They've got AMD. Aha, yes, they do. There we go, Intel 115X. So all of those different ones, and it is going to be mounted from that way. And then we have to use, they do include some thermal paste. So there's this little container of thermal paste, thermal compound, Deep Cool. I've got my own that I'm going to be using anyway, so that's fine. Okay, so we need these 4 long threaded bolts, which are going to go into this. Now, from which side? Okay, so we're going in from that side, and we are going to go into the innermost connections. Yes, we are. There we go. So these little plates are normally universal, so they'll work for all different sockets. Now, I must admit, if you're just fitting something with a stock cooler from Intel or AMD, it tends to be a little bit easier than this and a little bit less fiddly. And actually, to give AMD sockets their credit, what you do tend to find actually is that those are, on the whole, a lot easier to fit. Because a lot of the time, a lot of the aftermarket coolers use exactly the same mount as the stock one, which is already fitted to the motherboards. Okay, so like I said, this is the important bit where having that cutout in the back is really prevalent, because now we have to put this plate through the back. So there's pre-drilled holes in the motherboards. Don't drill any new ones. Pre-drilled holes in the back of the motherboard that we slot this through. And then from the front, we are then going to be adding a number of standoffs with these plastic washers, because they are metal standoffs, which I assume they've put in place to ensure you don't create any shorts if you've got any close components. But anyway, we screw these on. It's a nice tight thread, so it actually takes a bit of time. And what this is then going to give you is 4 standoffs around the CPU, which are threaded, which you will then bolt the actual cooler down to. So here we go. I'm doing this in a cross pattern. A lot of things like this you want to do in a cross pattern to make sure that you've got an equal pressure. 2 more of these to do. We are then 1 step closer to where we need to be. Last one. So what I'm doing as I'm screwing this on is I'm just holding the plate from the back as well, just to stabilize it, to put these on. And there we go. So we've got the first part of the mounting mechanism is on there. The next part is going to be fitting the actual cooling tower along with 2 of these brackets. So let's just make sure I get the right ones. So those are too big, so it's the 2 smaller ones. Yep, there we go. So there's 2 metal brackets that come with this cooler, and they screw down onto the base of the cooler with 2 little screws that we've got in here. So I'm just going to quickly get those popped on, and we will then move on to the next stage. So there we go. We've got all of the mounting mechanism now on here. So these are the 2 parts that we've just put on. You can see here we've got to remove this before we install it, which is just a plastic cover. This particular cooler doesn't have thermal paste pre-applied. So that's something that we are going to have to do. Now, this is a big debate. What is the best way to apply thermal paste? There's all different designs, different ways of doing it. You can put a big X in thermal paste. You can put a small to medium-sized grain of rice of thermal paste. Some people use a spreader. There's all different methods. For me, I am just going to use the small grain of rice approach. So I'm using MX4 thermal compound from Arctic. This is good thermal compound. This works well, and it's a good all-rounder for builds with great thermal properties. And like I said, all I'm doing here is essentially just squeezing out a grain of rice size piece in the middle of the heatsink. The heat spreader, which is the metal piece exposed up on top of the CPU. Right, there we go. So the processor's got its thermal compound on. What we now do is we're now going to mount that tower cooler down onto that. Now, orientation is key here. So you'll see on top of this, if I just bring it across back to this camera, on top you've got the Deep Cool logo. So that needs to be facing that way. And actually the fan is already set up to pull air and push air through the heatsink here and then towards the exhaust fan at the back. But let's get this one in. Now, as before, because we've obviously already put those standoffs in. In fact, I'm going to have to take this fan off to make sure we screw this down all right. So let me just take this back off. As we did with the standoffs before, this is where it's really important to use that diagonal approach, because you've got the 4 standoffs to screw this off down to. It's important to use that diagonal approach to get the right mounting pressure. There we go. Place that on like so, and then this cooler came with some screws to mount it down, and those screws actually have integrated springs. So you'll see the springs on there, and the idea is that's keeping a firm mount with everything underneath. So I will get these screwed on, and I will be back with you. Rightio, so that's it. The cooler is all mounted down. Like I said, I've used that diagonal pattern to to make sure that we are connecting down on an even base to spread that thermal paste and make sure we're getting the best thermal contact. Next up, I need to put this fan back on. This particular fan has a 4-pin connector on it, and that's going to connect to the CPU connector or fan header on the motherboard. Now, I'm pointing this out because it's quite important that you connect it to that one, because if nothing's connected to that one, it's likely to be that when the system is booting, you'll keep getting an error message every time it boots to say that there is no fan. Now, whilst the computer will still work and you can kind of force past that, it's a bit annoying. So you might as well make sure that's connected to the right fan connector on the motherboard. Don't plug it into CPU alt or CPU opt or AIO, unless it's an AIO, obviously. And all those sort of bits and pieces. Make sure you are going into the right fan header. This is a fiddly bit, having to put the fan back on inside the case, but there was no way of screwing that in efficiently with it still on. So there we go, and I'm plugging it in now to the CPU fan header on the motherboard. Real simple. Tuck the cable away underneath the fan so it's just nice and clean and looks good. That's it. Cooler's in. So what we've done so far, motherboard is in with motherboard standoffs. We've done the CPU, the processor. The processor is in the board, fairly easy process, and the 2 sticks of RAM are done. Now, we've got a couple of options. We can either go now down the PSU route, which is the power supply. We can put in the case fans, or we can do the GPU/SSDs. I think the GPU probably is going to be the last. It's the crown and glory of any gaming PC. I think what we'll do next is we will, whilst we're limiting the weight in this before we actually put the power supply in, is we'll pop this front off. So this particular case has got clips all the way down, which is holding the front on. I'm going to pop this front off, hopefully without breaking it. It's actually metal as well, which is unusual. They're normally plastic on the front. But yes, we're going to pop in the Corsair fans. So we've got 3 Corsair fans that are going in the front. These were salvaged from another build. So yes, before there's comments below saying for a budget build using Corsair SP120s is not exactly the most cost-effective solution. It is when they didn't cost anything. So here we go. So these particular fans are Cable City. There are loads of cables because you've got one cable which is for the fan itself, the control of the fan, and the other one then is the RGB cable to plug into the RGB hub, which came with these fans. So I've got that ready to go as well. So it is a bit of cable management, but do it right and it will look great. So let's get the, which is going to be the best one to do first? Probably the bottom, because if we go in from the top, we're probably going to reduce access to the bottom and then not be able to actually get the bottom one in. So let's do the bottom one first. I'm making sure that the Corsair logo is facing the right way up. So that goes into here, like so. And then we just need to get some screws to pop those in. Now, did I bring any screws with these? Let's have a look. If not, I do have some in my kit. There's a few screws in here, so let's use those for now. Okay. So trusted screwdriver, again. And all we're going to do there is just hold the fan up to the mounting points, mount them in diagonal fashion again, and just to say hold them from the back and put them in. Now the first time you put fans in, there'll always be a bit of a challenge because essentially the screws have to tap the holes, whereas obviously once they've been used once, they've then got a bit of thread on them. But let's get these ones in. I am going to cheat, I won't lie. I'm only going to put 2 screws into each fan. It's all that is really needed. And it speeds up the build time so that you guys don't get too bored. There you go, 1 fan in. So same again with this wire madness. There we go. So like I say, you are going to have a fair bit of wires to deal with, but just bear in mind, you know, you've got, if you get that RGB goodness in there, you're adding what, 10 FPS at least. So it's worth getting it in with the RGB. This was slightly different. I'm going to have to run the cable up and around the top fan to get it sitting good. And make sure that it's cable managed. So I'll talk a lot about cable management because for me, I think that's quite important. You know, you've probably put a fair bit of money into this. you might as well make it look good at the same time. Okay, that is fan number 2. All in. Now, in terms of how many fans to put in, this is always an interesting one. So there'll always be an argument between what's called positive pressure or negative pressure. Put simply, it's all about, do you have more air coming in or going out of your system? Now, everybody will have different beliefs of what's the best thing to do. Now, my challenge to negative air pressure is that with a lot of cases, the fan intakes are normally or have some level of filtering. Now, the problem you have is that if you create a negative pressure environment, that means essentially you're drawing more air out of the case than you're putting in. You create a very minor vacuum, and it means then that the case will be drawing in air through all the little gaps around the side window, all the little gaps around the back and the bottom, so on and so forth, which aren't filtered. So in my mind, a negative air pressure setup will normally result in a dustier system. So I always go with a positive air setup, and this is going to be a positive air setup to the extreme, because it's going to have 3 fans in the front and 1 exhaust. So 1 exhaust in the rear there, which is drawing air out of the back. Why am I doing that, do you ask? I'm going to be really honest. It's a cheap budget motherboard, and I don't have a lot of fan headers. I do have an adapter here to give you more fan headers, but that's still only going to give me enough to do those 4. So there we go. That's what it's having, because it's only got 1 system fan header on the actual board itself. So these fans are in. We have got a big cable mess down the back, but we will be sorting that shortly. And they actually look really good, to be fair, and I'm quite looking forward to seeing how that looks when it's actually lit up. But once that's done, we can pop that front panel back on. And I say, with this particular case, it's closed fronted and it's got air vents down the sides, which is where it draws the air in from. It's also one of the reasons why having 3 fans versus 1 exhaust is going to allow those fans a chance to be able to keep up and not create negative pressure because of the lack of airflow in the front of the case. Okay, let's pop in the rear fan as well while we're here. And let's grab some of these adapters. So we've got the adapter from Corsair, which is for their lighting. So that's got to go in the back. So we've got to put that in, and that's SATA powered. And then we've got a fan header adapter. Oh, actually, the fan header adapter will give us 5 fans. Okay, we'll put another one in the top as well. So we've got 2 going out. So actually, let's get that in right now so that it's ready to go. I was trying to remember where the system fan header is on this board, because I think, if I remember rightly, it's in a really stupid place. Yep, there it is, right in the middle of the board. I will never, ever understand why they would put one there, but that's where it is. So let's run this up from underneath. And it's going to have to go there and underneath the graphics card. Now, all of these adapters have got sticky pads on the back so that they can be mounted neatly into the system. There we go. So we will pull that tight and run that down through the bottom for the best place to put it. And that means all of these 3 fans are going to go into it, and then we're going to put 2 other case fans in as well. So I've got spare stock here of white and black fans, so it goes with the build. I've got 3 left in this pack, so we're going to be using 2 of those. Let's grab some screws. There we go. Pop them back down there. So we're going to put 1, the top will actually take 2, but we're going to put 1 right at the back and then 1 right on the actual back of the case, just to take off this magnetic fan filter. And again, cable management, make sure you're orientating the fan to face towards the back of the case So it's nice and easy to just route that fan cable through and down to your fan headers. And I must say, these fans have got fairly short cables in comparison to a lot of other fans. Right, there we go. But, you know, it's only fans, isn't it? Okay, here we go. Where did they put those screws? That was clever. Do you guys see where I put those screws? See, this is the problem. I'm just working in a mess. How could I possibly have lost those screws so quickly? Ah, there they are. Okay. So same as on the front, I'm going to be lazy and I'm going to use 2 screws per fan. It actually looks like this would actually take 140mm fans as well if I wanted to. But obviously we're not, we're using 120s. There we go. Now, the fans you'll see on the front, as I said, have been set as intakes. These are exhausts. Normally, how that would work is that on the back of the, what we're going to call it the back of the fan, you've got this cage, this chassis, this basically the casing of the fan with these bars coming across. That would normally be considered the back, and normally airflow would go that way. So it's going out through here. On a lot of fans, you'll actually have somewhere around the outsides an indicator as to which way it goes. Yeah, and on this one, it's tucked in right in there, and it's just got an arrow to show the direction of the air. So yeah, these are being set up as exhausts. This one's going in the back. And again, we're just going to loop the cable up through this rear grommet. It's the same grommet where we put the processor power cable. And I know it's facing out, but I'm still being fussy and making sure the logo's the right way up. You see, some things I insist on. Other times I'll just use 2 screws to put a fan in. There we go. So here's an interesting question to those more experienced watching the video. Obviously, we're working on cooling at the moment. What's your preference? Do you prefer air cooling, or do you prefer AIO or custom loop water cooling? So for me, on my personal rig, I use a combination of an AIO and air cooling. I'd like to do custom loop water cooling in the future. The only thing that really stops me at the moment is cost. It can actually be a hell of an investment. You could be talking quite easily £500 to put together a decent all-encompassing loop, and I say all-encompassing because we're using the GPU as well as the CPU. But yeah, what do you guys think? Do you think air cooling? Now, I know a lot of other YouTube channels have done comparison videos. Linus Tech Tips did a really good one actually, comparing decent quality tower coolers from like Noctua and that sort of thing to using an AIO, and actually they found that the tower coolers were just as good. And actually, if you buy a decent quality tower cooler, in terms of noise, they aren't particularly loud. Right, I'm just trying to think where's the best place to mount this fan header, because it's quite slim here, and I think if I put it straight onto the back here, with the fan connectors on as well, it actually won't fit. So I'm going to have to think of a different solution there. Anyway, we'll come to that shortly. Let's get this in So this is the control board for the Corsair lighting. Essentially, it has SATA power and it has a connection to a USB 2 header, which luckily we do have. All right, let's give this a sec. So let's make sure that goes into junction 1. Always nice to put them in a certain order so that if you do particular light effects, they actually make sense and work. Cool. And then we have that, which will go into number 2. And that into number 3. Now, bear in mind, if you're building a PC for the first time, RGB is optional. I think it's an option you should definitely do, but it is optional. So do factor that in terms of costs and budgets and all that sort of jazz. Okay. Right, so we need to run this cable, which is a USB 2 header, through to the USB 2 header on the back, which is right down at the bottom, which is good, nice and easily accessible, and not in the middle of the board like that system fan header, which is just silly. Be happy to say that, to my knowledge, ASUS don't really do that anymore since in more recent times. But there we go, that's in. And then we need to mount this somewhere on the back of the case. What I'm going to use for that is I should have some adhesive pads in here to use, because I've just realised that doesn't have anything on there. And I don't want it to short out because it is an open unit, because it's an OEM part. Right. Do I have sticky pads in here? I'll be right back, guys. I just need to go and grab a sticky pad to put that stuff on. I'm back with some fixing pads. Sorry about that, guys. Right, let's get this mounted into the back. Before this video gets really long, so these are just self-adhesive foam, which slightly raise it, so making sure that it is insulated away from anything on the back of the case. There we go. And now I think the best thing for us to be doing now is to route the front cable connectors and then to put the power supply in. That's our next best bet. Okay, so there is our USB 3.0 connector, which I'm going to try and run, because it's a black cable, I'm going to try and run it in behind the 24 pin, so that it's hidden away a bit, and that's been successful, so that's good. And then we've got the audio, HD audio, which is for the front panel, headphone and microphone ports, and that is, gosh, there it is, all the way over there. That's going to be a challenge. Talk amongst yourselves. I'm just going to quickly unwrap some of this factory done cable management so that I've got a bit more slack on this cable, so I can bring it across and plug it in down the bottom. Now you will be seeing as I'm doing this that on the B-roll picture, it is a bit of a bird's nest in the back here. That will all be sorted out. Now, the reason I want to go on after doing the front panel connectors to doing the PSU is that I haven't yet mounted the fan header adapter. And the reason being is knowing the best place to put it, because like I said, I'm a little bit concerned that the case isn't deep enough for it to just literally mount straight on the back of the motherboard plate. It's going to have to go somewhere else. But to do that, I am going to have to put in the power supply first, so I can see what space that I've got. Right, I am almost done. I am just putting in the last of these front panel connectors, and we will be good to go. Okay, so there we go. Front panel connectors are all done. Fans are all in. It's time for the power supply. So very bog standard power supply just to go into the bottom underneath this PSU shroud. This doesn't have a removable panel on the back, so it's got to go in from this side. Now, hopefully I've not made a mistake by having some of these cables already in, but let's have a look. Nope, there we go. We are in. And essentially what happens with the power supply is that's going to draw air from the bottom of the case. There is openings in the bottom of the case, through the unit and out the back. So it's kind of like its own little chamber, keeping any heat from the power supply out of the system. In some other cases, you will find the power supply sits in the top and draws air from inside the system out, but that is quite unusual these days. There we go. I must say, actually, for a budget case, this case is actually quite easy to work in. Which is good to see, because sometimes with budget cases they're an absolute nightmare, especially if you've got sharp edges. And like I say, all of the edges in this case are rolled, so it's all quite nice and comfortable. So if you are looking for a budget case and you like the look of this one, I will make sure, like I said before, that there is a link in the video description. So do check that out. Now, with the power connectors on the back here, obviously we've already put in those sleeved extensions. So it's simply a case of plugging things in to those sleeved extensions. So on the back here, I'm just plugging in the 24 pin into the extension that's on there. All quite simple. And then I've also got the CPU power, which is here. So we'll get that plugged in as well. Okay, that's that in. And then obviously we've got PCIe power, which we'll be doing shortly. But I also need to use the SATA power connectors, one of which is going to be used to power that lighting controller from Corsair. And then we've got the hard drives, which we'll also pop in next, because now's a good time to do it, before we finish off with the GPU. So now we're putting in the SSDs. You could be using a hard drive, you could be using an NVMe or an M.2, which would go on the board. This particular board doesn't have M.2, so it's just SATA connectors. On the back of this, you have two connectors, one of which is for power, one of which is for data. So we've got SATA cables to run data through to the motherboard, and then obviously power coming from the power supply. This has different places in which you can mount these drives. It has a dedicated 2.5-inch drive bay on the back, so we are going to use that for the boot drive. And then down in the basement, you have got a choice of 3.5-inch and 2.5-inch drive bays. So the 2.5 inches ones will go in there. Okay. So we need to make sure we mount this so the cables are fully accessible, and cleverly they design it like that so it's nice and easy. So let's put these into here. Now, I'm only going to be using 2 screws with this, and I'm doing that to point out the fact that actually these are quite resilient. You could technically stick them anywhere, get some double-sided sticky tape and bang them somewhere in there and they'll be fine. Whereas a hard drive, so a spinning disk drive, you need to make sure that you mount that properly. That can't be done half-heartedly because you will end up with problems. Those spinning platters do not bode well with large vibrations, so getting them fixed down is quite important. Well, there we go. SSDs are in, it's all cable managed, the back is on, there's no bowing, it's all nicely tucked away inside and working well. It's actually, well, there was a lot more space than I thought there was going to be, so it works quite well. Now, obviously, using cable extensions, it's also a benefit because it means that all of those ketchup and mustard cables that come on these cheaper power supplies, this is a Cooler Master one, they can just hide away in the basement. So they're gone and you can't see them. And it actually looks quite good from the front. But regardless of that, we do still have one more big thing to do, which is to put in and connect the GPU. So yeah, these are the rarest things on earth at the moment, GPUs. And this is an Asus Strix. Now bear in mind, this is a budget build, 3000 series, 2000 series GPUs. They're just, you're going to pay well above MSRP for them at the moment. So this is a budget build. It's something I had in stock, which is a Asus Strix GTX 970. Perfectly fine for 1080p gaming. Yeah, probably not going to be the most competitive thing in the world, but it certainly will work fine. This is a dual slot card, and on this particular board, we're going to be using the very top slot on the motherboard. So that means we're going to need to remove from the back here 2 of these PCIe covers. That is something I do like about this case, despite the fact it's a budget case. It hasn't got snap-off rear covers. It's actually got screwed-in covers. So if you haven't seen it before, some of the really cheap cases will have these little snap-off panels. So once they're out, they're out. And if you want to replace them, you'll have to go and buy a set of these, which are the screw-in ones. So pretty cool to see that on a budget case, that is what we've got. Now, installing this is very, very simple. On your top PCIe slot, which will tend to be a 16 times slot, on the back you've got a little rock down clip similar to what you saw on the RAM, just bigger. You need to make sure that that is open, and then you just need to line up the connector here with that. Now obviously we've already put in the power cable for this as well, which we'll be plugging in shortly, but just line that up with it. Make sure your ports are lined up to go into the back of the case. And this one actually has really nicely made little slots for the little legs to go down into. And then you'll get that reassuring clip when it goes in, because that little clip on the back is lifted up and connected in. And we are good. So that is the GPU in. Now I just need to run in the power cable. On this particular GPU, it is a 8-pin, so a single 8-pin connector. Some will have none at all, so very entry-level GPUs will just literally be powered from the socket. That tends to mean that they have a TDP that is much lower because the power draw from the socket is enough, and it doesn't need auxiliary power. But in the case of this one, it very much does. So it's got that 8-pin connector. Some more modern graphics cards can go all the way up to 3 8-pin connectors. Or if you're into the latest NVIDIA Founder Edition cards, you'll be stuck with this really weird little 12-pin connector, which is completely pointless, in my opinion. Anyway, I'm going to get this screwed in nice and tight. Now, my reason for doing that is I'm running the cables from underneath, which means it might pull down a little bit. Along with the weight of the card, you can get some GPU sag. I don't have a sag bracket in this, so you can buy a little bracket to support it. But as long as you've got it nicely mounted and it's not too heavy of a card, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So I'm just using the same screws to screw that back in that the back plate covers were originally using. So that's all in. If I turn this upright, there we go. We have a completed system. So I'm going to get this all powered up and you can see it then in all of its glory. So I'll be right back with you. Okay, so there we go. All finished, booted up, and I think looking absolutely fantastic for what is actually a budget build. But you'll see for yourself, putting a PC together is fairly simple. Hopefully just following what I've done throughout this video will give you a great guide on how to do just that. I've obviously, since this has been finished, I've installed Windows 10. That's all done, installed via USB. And yeah, like I said, I think it looks fantastic. We've just got a very subtle light theme going on here, kind of a whitey blue theme. And I think it looks fantastic in the case. So look, if you've got any questions at all about building your own PC, any questions about parts, anything like that, make sure you stick it in the comment section below. Either I or somebody else from the community, I'm sure, will answer it. If you like any of the parts that have been used in this, if they're still available, I'll make sure I put links in the video description. They are Amazon paid links, so we do get a little bit of a kickback to the channel, so I do appreciate it if you use those. Other than that, if you're not subscribed, what on earth are you doing? Make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit the bell to be notified for future videos. Other than that, thank you for stopping by, and I will see you next time.